Hello folks, I'm Trev Makes It Easy, the channel where we make learning easy. In this series, Trev on Econ, I'll be taking you through topics you're likely to run into in any introductory course in economics at the college or university level. My goal is to make economics less scary, more approachable, and, if I can, mildly enjoyable. With that being said, let's make it easy. All right, folks, welcome back to part 2 of our GDP discussion. In this video, we're going to be looking at the different approaches to measuring GDP. Now, there are effectively 3 different approaches. The first one is called the Expenditure Approach, and this one focuses on spending. All right, this is more of we are buying stuff. So how much money are we spending on the goods and services we're choosing to purchase? There's also the income approach, which the name is kind of obvious, but this focuses on income. So when people spend money, that spending becomes someone else's income in some capacity. So instead of looking at money going out, we're looking at money coming in. And the third one is what we call the value-added approach. And this one focuses on production. This one is going to look at those stages of development along the supply chain. In the last video, we used this example of a copper ore to a copper bar to a copper sheet to copper wire. This approach is going to consider all 4 of those steps and measure them differently. Now, the nice thing about these approaches is that all these approaches should equal the same number. All right, this is going to be very handy. Now, why do they equal the same number? Well, the answer is kind of simple. All right, when I spend money, that spending becomes someone else's income. So my spending should equal income because they're aligned. But the production process from value added, that's going to be how we get the price that tells us, well, what are we spending? And effectively, the money has to travel equally. We can't just magically lose money somewhere. So we should see these 3 things be equal. Now, why this is handy is because even though we're going to look at all 3 today, we really only need to focus on one of them if they all give the same answer. Why have 3 techniques to find the same result when we can just focus on one and get that result? Now, some teachers might be different. Some may lend credence to one or the other approaches. I will tell you right now that we are going to spend the bulk of our time with the expenditure approach. So let's start there. So the expenditure approach, again, focuses on spending. And this is where we are going to see probably the most common formula in all of macroeconomics, especially at the introductory level, and that is this. It is consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus exports minus imports. Okay? It is made up of all these sections. And you can imagine we're going to go and discuss each of these momentarily. All right? But we also want to get used to this variable version, which I mean, instead of spelling out the words, we will usually see C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And you can match those accordingly to who they go with. Now, quick thing I'll note here, some people combine these 2 into what's called NX, and that just stands for net exports. Okay. Just don't be surprised if you see X minus M or NX. They're pretty interchangeable. I think most courses will start off by showing X minus M, but then they get lazy and they start putting NX. But you should be familiar with both approaches, or both variable names, because you're likely to see both. Now, let's break down some of these categories and talk about what they mean. Again, this is going to be the one you see most often, so we better spend the most time with it. So our first variable is consumption, which is C, all right? And this is spending by individuals and households. Right? So when you go to the store and buy groceries, that's consumption. When Jeff Bezos goes and buys a new yacht, that's consumption. Not a yacht, let's say. Then Jeff Bezos pays his electrical bill. That is consumption. When your family goes, holiday shopping, that is consumption. All right. This is, in general, for most countries, again, it varies, but usually the largest component of GDP. Okay. Here in Canada, consumption makes up about like 60% of the equation, where investment, government expenditure, import, exports makes up the other 40%. So consumption is a very large piece. Some people break this down to 3 categories. You don't always do this, but I'll do it just to be safe. Number 1 is non-durable goods. So that are things we buy and use up within a year. So for example, if I was to go to the store, buy a chicken breast, I'm probably going to eat that chicken breast within the year. If you don't, you might get very, very sick. But there's things that, again, we expect to use up fairly quickly. There's also durable goods, which are just the opposite. Things we buy and expect to last longer than a year. So for example, maybe I buy new tires for my car. I'm not expecting to have to change those tires next year unless something random happens. So those are going to last a while. All right. And then the final category is just services. So the word we use these are intangible things we buy. Right? I can't touch banking. I can't touch teaching. These are services that you can purchase. Right? The next one is investment, the I component. This is spending by firms. Okay? So businesses. And usually this is spent on capital. Right? Machinery, equipment, new buildings, etc. Okay. Now, you should be a little careful here. Again, not the most important thing in the world, but it does sometimes come up as a trick. We use gross investment. All right. Remember, this is gross domestic product, so we use gross investment. All that means is that you want to be familiar with a very small equation, which is that gross investment equals net investment plus depreciation. Okay. I have seen this used as a trick where they give you net investment and depreciation, and students are asked to calculate GDP, and they run into the issue of, oh, well, I don't have gross investment, so what do I do? Well, you have to take that net, add the depreciation to it, and that becomes gross investment. You can't just add net investment. You can't just add depreciation. You have to add them together to go back to gross. Okay. The other thing I will add to this, and this is a thing we mentioned in the last video, but this does not include stocks and bonds. Okay. We often run into this issue because when we're speaking together in casual conversation and I say investment, a lot of people think of, oh, buy bonds, buy stocks, that's investing. But again, stocks and bonds are not the type of investment we mean here. We mean things like investing in new machinery, in new equipment, in new capital, things that have a physical being, for lack of a better word. All right. Watch out for these. Again, they fall into that category of common tricks. The next one is government expenditure. So again, this one kind of gives it away, but government expenditure is just that. It is spending by the government, right? There's basically 2 big ways this can happen. Okay. Infrastructure is a huge one. So roads, buildings, different physical assets throughout a city or a town. and government functions sectors. So like things for the military or things for public service workers, anyone who, again, works under that government umbrella, any money they are spending falls into government expenditure. All right. So this is where it gets a little tricky, because let's say the president or prime minister of your country, if they buy something for themselves, like at their house, that's just consumption. That's C. But if they use the government budget to buy something for, their country or town, that becomes government expenditure. So we have to be careful about where we put things sometimes. This one also has a weird exclusion. It does not include transfer payments. Okay. We haven't talked about transfer payments yet, but transfer payments are where the government gives you money but gets nothing in return. Okay. Usually, this is things like welfare programs, okay, or social assistance. So, for example, in Canada, when you lose your job, you get something called employment insurance, which is the government will give you money for X number of weeks to help you as you find a new job. When the government gives you that money, they're getting nothing in return. There's no production being produced from that. So we just can't include these. These are basically one-way payments, and because there's not something reciprocally happening or coming back to them in exchange, they're just not a part of that type of spending that we're interested in. All right. Kind of a small thing, but again, you got to watch out for these exclusions in this chapter. They're very common, and again, depending on your teacher, they love to play around with these. Okay, so be careful. The last one I'm going to lump together, so net exports. NX, which again is equal to exports X minus imports M. And you can imagine this is spending with foreign countries. All right. Be careful. All right. Be careful of the negative on imports. This one gets everyone all the time. You get very used to adding things up. All right. Again, most of it is just adding things. Imports is the one thing you have to subtract, because that's money leaving the country to pay for production outside of the country. So this is stuff we're using or consuming or, using in some capacity, but it wasn't produced in this country, which means we don't want to count it towards GDP. We need to subtract it off to say, oh, that was produced, just not here. All right. And you can run into some issues with, like, my exports are another country's imports and their exports are my imports. So there's going to be some directional things you have to watch out for. In general, whenever you see exports, imports, or net exports, just pause for a second and make sure you understand what side of that equation or that relationship you're on. It can make a big difference, right? So those are our pieces. The math, very easy. You just add them up. They tell you C, I, G, X, M. You add C, you add I, you add G, you add X, but you subtract M and you're done. Again, watch out for that gross investment piece. That's probably the other math trick you might run into. But the math itself is very simple. This equation, however, is going to be used time and time and time and time again. You really want this one burned into your head. All right. It will come up in pretty much every video we do. Not everyone, but any video on macro we do is probably going to have this be relevant to it. All right. Now, the next approach is the income approach. I am going to talk about this one very briefly. And the reason is simple. I rarely teach it. I rarely use it, because in my mind, we have the expenditure approach that does a better job. So let's just use that. So the income approach, again, it's focusing on the money coming in as opposed to the money going out. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. I just think it's less approachable. That's a stupid joke compared to the expenditure approach. But we'll lay it out for you just in case. It is made up of national income. National income is a whole bunch of different things. It's basically any possible way you get money in a country. So we have wages and salaries, plus rent income, plus interest income, plus profit income. In fact, if you go back way back to like some of our earliest videos, these are all incomes for factors of production. This is for labor, this is for land, this is for capital, this is for entrepreneurship. It's just the different sources of money we can get, right? However, on top of this national income, which is made up of all these different incomes, there's more things to include. So in general, the income approach is equal to national income, which we just defined above, plus sales tax, plus depreciation, plus net foreign factors. Okay. So you start to see, oh, there's depreciation. We kind of saw that in expenditure. Net foreign factor, that's probably playing with like the exports and imports. Even sales tax, that's like the government's income or probably one of their main sources of income. So you start to see it play out. Again, though, we rarely use this one. Expenditure is just easier to work with. Okay. A lot of the times we will capture this. We usually just call income Y. Okay. In fact, you'll often see us say income Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. All right. This Y is capturing the whole income approach. It's just a nice way to simplify and say, yeah, all my income, we'll just call it Y, should be equal to all my spending, C, I, G, and X. All right. Again, we technically are using the income approach. We're just vastly oversimplifying it and not considering the pieces nearly as much as we might if we were really diving into it. Again, your course might be different, but in my experience, the income approach kind of gets looked over. So give it the love you need to for your specific situation. Most people will not need it. The final thing is the value-added approach. This one is best shown through an example. All right. What we're effectively trying to do is counting the value added, hence the name, at each step of the production process. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're going to set up a simple example. We are going to have a mine, so a mine in the ground, big hole, and they are going to have a starting value and an ending value. Actually, let's say value added. And then an ending value. So, close your eyes and get your imagination going. What's basically going to happen is this. The mine starts with just an empty hole in the ground. It is worth $0. There's no value. You have just made a giant hole. But you're going to find a diamond, and we're going to find a $100 diamond worth $100. Obvious. But that is value we have added. So 0 plus 100 means we are going to sell that diamond for $100. Okay? Now that diamond has to go somewhere. So let's send it off to a jeweler. That is spelled like that, maybe. And that $100 we just had is going to be their starting value. Okay? They're going to buy the diamond for $100, right? Because they have to pay for all the value added by the mine. They are going to add their own value. Let's say they're going to add $150 of value, and that is going to create an end value of $250, right? Well, where does that go? Well, that's going to go to the next person. Let's call this person just the jewelry store. So, same thing. They buy it off the jeweler for $250. They have to put it in their store. They're going to market it. They're going to put in pretty packaging. They're going to add, let's say, their own $200, just to be simple. And that is going to now be worth $450, right? And then you come along. You're looking to, I don't know, get married, buy an engagement ring, whatever it is you're going to do. And then you buy this ring for $450. Okay. And again, that is just basic supply chain stuff, right? As you go down the supply chain, every step should add value, and then the customer pays a final price. Cool. Well, one of the neat things here is that if you look at the value added at each step, hence the name value added approach, right? If I take 100 plus 150 plus 200, I have added $450 of value, right? Well, it just so happens the price that the customer pays is $450. And this is why the value added approach works. It basically tells you the components that make up the final price. In fact, this also shows us why we can't count intermediate goods. This is an intermediate good, this is an intermediate good, and this is an intermediate good. If I counted these three things plus the final sale, I would have 450 plus 450, and I'd get that double counting issue we talked about in the last video. This also raises the reason why we would never use the value-added approach in practice. Why would I use this large approach when I just need that final number? That final number gives me the same answer as doing all this work. And this one was fairly simple, right? I went through 3 little processes and got my final result. Imagine if we did this for something like a computer. We've got all these raw materials coming from all over the world to combine into different computer pieces, to combine into a pre-built computer. This value-added approach would be insane. It would be a massive mind map of different steps, and all these things would have to get added up, when in reality, we could just be like, okay, well, what did the computer sell for? Oh, that's its value. Again, all these approaches are valuable. They all kind of show a different thing. But at the end of the day, all the approaches give the same value. Okay? Expenditure should equal income, should equal value added. We will mainly use expenditure simply because it provides the most insight at the highest level. Okay. Again, are there situations where you would look deeper into an income approach? Absolutely. They're just far more rare. Would you ever use the value added? Maybe for like simple processes or like from managing a firm perspective. But in a general sense, it's that expenditure approach which is going to offer the most value to us. So we're going to spend the most time with it and getting used to it. That's going to wrap it up for today. Again, this is going to give us our look at how we can approach GDP. Next video, we're going to dive into some mathematics behind GDP and cover some common tips and tricks surrounding mathematical problems, things to watch out for, and types of questions you're likely to see. With that being said, that's it for today. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Well, folks, that wraps up another lesson for today. I hope it was helpful. If you found the video valuable, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions about the content or requests for other topics or subjects you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment below. Until next time, keep learning and make it easy.